So there's this new legislative agenda that some people in government are pushing now. And if this gets passed, that's it. That's the end. It's totalitarianism. It's over. It's too late to do anything about it. Pretty much every year, several times a year, if not like a dozen times a year, I hear people say that about some proposed legislation. It's never true. Not only is it never true, it's profoundly idiotic. And yet, the people who get attention by being fearmongers, or just people who are delusional and don't know how reality works, and so they're terrified at everything, say this and they mean it. Open a history book. Soviet Russia happened. It was really bad. It was worse than you can imagine. If you grew up in America, you cannot imagine anything close to what the people went through in Soviet Russia. Nazi Germany happened. North Korea is still happening. And yet, humanity goes on. Red China happened and killed somewhere around 42 million of their own people. The ruling class killed their own people, starving most of them to death. And the world kept going. Now, it's really horrible. I'm not saying, hey, don't worry about authoritarian stuff. I'm saying when you do the thing of, this is the end of the world, there's no getting past this. If this passes, you're just being a clueless, delusional fearmonger. There's nothing that can pass or be enacted into law that's suddenly going to make, well, that's the end. Nobody will believe in freedom anymore, and nobody ever will in the future. And it's so weird to me that I still see a bunch of pro-freedom people getting that attitude and saying that, oh, if this passes, it's the end of the world. No, it's not. No matter what passes. And in this case, there's actually, when the parasites push too fast, it actually, in the long run, even though it can inflict temporary horrible injustice on people, in the long run, it backfires in a lot of cases. And so if tomorrow, well, they're outlawing private ownership in the U.S., that's it, they passed the law, it's over, we're all doomed. No, we wouldn't be. Very quickly, that would backlash, and that would fall over in 2 seconds flat, and huge numbers of like sheriffs and law enforcers would refuse to enforce it. Some would probably say, yeah, we'll enforce it, we'll blindly do as we're told, and then a few of them would get shot. By the way, I would be one of the ones shooting them. If you decide, yep, the politician said go to door and disarm everybody, I would be one of the ones shooting you for doing that. And there'd be lots of others, and it doesn't have to be a majority. 1% of the population is still over 3 million people. If 3 million people said, yeah, we're not giving up our guns, and we're not going to let you take our neighbors' guns either, we're going to shoot you, that's it. That literally outnumbers the biggest military in the world. But even if something gets passed, like there in most of the world and in the nastiest tyrannies in history, the people weren't armed. They were either disarmed or they never were armed to begin with. And yet, freedom keeps coming back. So I hate it when people do this ridiculous thing of pretending that, well, if they pass this legislation, that's it, it's over, we're all doomed. It's weird. Once again, going into the psychology, it's weird that people have to go to alarmism and doom and gloom and end of the world instead of going, that would be really bad, that would be really unjust. It would not be at all new. That's happened in lots of places all over the world. It was really bad, and people responded to it. Lots of people got oppressed. Very bad things happened to lots of people under authoritarian regimes. And the human spirit, or whatever you want to call it, kept going. And the desire for freedom kept going. And to me, the most ridiculous thing about the people who are just like, if this passes, it's the end of the world. Like, if they get a digital currency, if the feds control a digital currency, it's the end of the world. No, it isn't. If they pass this gun control, it's the end of the... No, it isn't. if they get real ID, it's in. No, it isn't. Like, a bunch of stupid, immoral crap they may try, and they may succeed to varying degrees, it's still not the end of the world. And the idea that you have to pee yourself and give up if the political parasites scribble some piece of legislation, it's just pathetic, and it's counterproductive, because it's basically projecting onto the ruling class power that they don't stinking have. A lot of pro-freedom people talk as if, well, if they pass this, obviously they're going to magically have the power to enforce it. No, they won't. They don't just have unlimited resources. They have lots of money because they steal lots and they can print their own. They don't have an unlimited number of enforcers. And even during the COVID stupidity, you saw a bunch of places where people said, yeah, we're not going along with that, and it fell apart. You even saw a bunch of like county sheriffs and stuff coming out saying, yeah, we're not going to go along with it either, and we're not enforcing it, so there's nobody you have to resist. Like, there's one political idiot who said, nobody's allowed to blah, 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 but his own enforcer said, yeah, we're not doing that. So regardless of who disobeys and who resists, it's weird to watch pro-freedom people imagine government to be omnipotent, like they can do anything, like they can enforce anything they want to. And one of the most glaring examples of this for me is a lot of the dystopian views of the future of like, it's going to be a police state where everybody's hiding in terror and it's fascists driving up and down the street nonstop. No, it isn't. Not in this country, not ever. And that isn't because Americans believe in freedom. Like, some of them sort of believe in freedom light, and the reason I'm still here and not going anywhere is a larger portion of Americans, I think, are capable of saying no and then enforcing that no than anywhere else in the world. It certainly isn't because this is the freest country, because it's not anywhere close. But it's still, as far as I can tell, talking to a bunch of people around the world, including Americans who went to other countries where it's, at least for now, freer, the spirit of actual disobedience and rebellion is still stronger here than it is anywhere else. Now, it's not the majority of people. Most people are just going along and blindly obeying, being idiots. But the idea of, like, the dystopian police state, like every street has cops and tanks driving up and down it, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do? You need to learn how cause and effect and economics work. You can't have a country where half of the country is enforcers of the state. That doesn't economically work. That's like having slave owners and slaves where there are as many slave owners as slaves. Well, we have this one nasty, mean overseer slave owning guy with one slave. First of all, it's going to be a full-time job for him to try to control that one guy. Second of all, that one guy is not going to produce enough to make that guy rich. Any ruling class has to be vastly outnumbered by their victims for the ruling class to get prosperity out of the deal. You can't have a king with one peasant. It doesn't work. Where are you going to get a castle and all your fancy schmancy? You need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of productive people handing over the fruits of their labor to a parasitic ruling class, or the ruling class doesn't have any wealth, doesn't have any power. And so in literally every single situation, the people ultimately have more power than the state. It's just, in a lot of cases, especially historically, one, they didn't at all have equality of weaponry. Like, if it's a king with a bunch of guards with swords and, like, the most high-tech weapon is a bow and arrow, like mediocre old medieval, not even like compound bow or something. Like, if that's the best that people have, yeah, normal people are going to have a hard time resisting. Now we have these things called rifles where you can shoot somebody really far away with just a rifle that's pretty damn cheap. So the equipment is there, and then the only other thing is the mentality. At what point do people adopt the mentality of, this is the line, we're not putting up with this crap if you come to enforce it, bad things are going to happen to you, Mr. and Mrs. Badge-wearing parasite of the state. So the idea that some law is going to be passed and then it's a totalitarian dystopia in the U.S., no, it isn't. And the people who think that way haven't bothered to understand, like, history, and haven't bothered to understand what it took for the worst tyrannies to happen. And this is something that so many people are oblivious. Like, you see 80 billion movies about Nazi Germany and how horrible it was. And curiously, you see hardly any movies about, like, Soviet Russia and Red China, despite the fact that they killed way more people. I wonder why that is. Well, that's a different topic. But you see these movies about, oh, that's horrible oppression. And it was horrible oppression for some people. You know what most Germans were doing during the Third Reich? Living their lives. Yeah, there were some police things going along. Not everybody was being harassed because no ruling class has the resources to do that. Now, if you were in Nazi Germany and you were Jewish, yeah, it would have sucked. Bad things would have happened. If you were just Germanic and going about your life and didn't do anything to get attention your way, your life wouldn't have been much worse under Nazi Germany than it was before that. Well, I go about this. In fact, in some ways, Hitler made... Well, no, I think that was Mussolini, actually, that made the trains run on time. But that turned into the legend of Hitler getting the trains to run on time. But there's a lot of... In any, like, the worst tyranny you can think of, most of the people are going about their lives not directly threatened by agents of the state, because there aren't enough agents of the state to directly threaten all your subjects. If there are, you don't have enough subjects for an empire. And people don't get that. And that's why, like, Red China, which was the worst tyranny in the history of the world, with the biggest death count of their own people, it was because so many people went rah, rah, rah and went along with it and were excited about it. Until it got so far downhill that they were like, well, now we don't dare to speak out, because if anybody speaks out, they get killed and stuff. So it's not that the tyranny doesn't happen, but you can't individually enforce, like, direct personal oppression on every single person. And that's why Red China and then, the Soviet Union did the all the way terrorist state routine of, they know they don't have enough forcers to harass every single person on a regular basis, but if they can make an example here or there and make everybody scared that, like, if I say anything, like, critical of the ruling class, not only are things going to happen to me, things are going to happen to my family and people I know, and others are going to turn me in, and the fear and the paranoia makes huge numbers of people into basically collaborators of the oppression. Well, my neighbor said something critical of Stalin. I better, like, turn him in, because if somebody finds out that I heard that and didn't turn him in, I'm going to be in trouble too. So people are squealing on each other and reporting each other. And so that avenue of control by way of a bunch of cowardly, compliant peasants is how the worst tyrannies in history were able to happen. It wasn't because the ruling class had enough actual paid enforcers to harass every single person. They don't. Again, the little video I did called The Tiny Dot, if you look at the number of people in the U.S. who are literally terrorized, it is directly, indisputably terrorist actions and a terrorist mentality that the IRS functions by. And they don't hide that fact. You can read it in their manuals. Well, the compliance effect of making an example out of somebody. Just it's exact same thing as the mafia breaking somebody's kneecaps. Hey, everybody, see this shop owner, he didn't pay his protection racket fees, so he smashed his kneecaps. Did you all see that? That's exactly what the IRS is. It's exactly how they function, and they don't hide it. The IRS is very literally and specifically a terrorist organization. They create fear in a huge number of people by going after a tiny percentage of them to make an example of them. That's how they function, evil bastards that they are. If they had to actually individually go after each person, they don't nearly have those resources. I've said it before, if 100 million Americans just said, I'm not even going to resist, I'm not even going to argue, but I'm not going to file and I'm not going to give it voluntarily, you, the IRS parasites, will have to come to me and audit me and say, well, here are the numbers we have and here's how much we think you owe, and eventually we'll go through the process and seize your bank account. If 100 million Americans said, okay, do that, but I'm not going to help you anymore. You're not going to terrorize me into helping you rob me. I'm not even going to resist. I'm going to let you go through the process to steal my bank account, which takes a while and there's a fair amount of bureaucracy involved. If 100 million people just did that, not even resist, not fight back, but just, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to help you rob me, you parasitical pieces of shit. That is the end of the income tax. They have nowhere near the resources to do a damn thing about that. So what they do instead, which is what every ruling class has to do, is act like terrorists, where they make an example here or there, especially of, find some famous person, Willie Nelson, Wesley Snipes. We'll make an example of them. They didn't pay tribute to the Lord God government, and so we shall, put their head up on London Bridge. Exact same mentality, it's just not quite as brutal and openly violent anymore. We caged this guy because he didn't pay tribute to us. Okay, you terrorist pieces of shit. But if the terrorism doesn't work anymore and people just go, we don't care. And by the way, we may resist too. But even just non-compliance, if the terrorism doesn't work, that's the end. Splat. There's no regime. And in fact, the Gandhi's whole approach, again, I'm nowhere near being a pacifist, but Gandhi's approach to the British Empire in India was all the way, not even passive, just non-violent, because passive implies you're not doing anything. And he was just saying, we're all going to live our lives, ignore their rules, do what we were going to do anyway. They'll beat some of us up and try to make an example, but we outnumber their enforcers a gazillion to one. So the story, I've talked about it before, of we're going to go to the sea and collect our own salt, even though the British Crown says, you're not allowed to do that. We're going to do it anyway. And the enforcers show up and, look, that's illegal. Beat the crap out of him. And, he didn't even fight back. We just beat the crap out of him. There, showed him who's boss. Then they look up and there's a line as far as they can see of more people. Yep, we're going to do it too. You're going to beat the crap out of us too. Only eventually you'll literally lose because you're too tired to keep beating the crap out of people who aren't even fighting back. Now, that would not be my approach. One sniper could very quickly end that overnight. But that goes into what the people think, and Gandhi's approach was to win over as many people as he could by showing the evil of authoritarianism. And so that's a different discussion. But either way, just people just saying, you can terrorize us and be scary and even hurt some of us. But if we don't help you victimize us, you have almost no power. And this is a thing that I've pointed out before. One of the most depressing things, like Nazi Germany and the cattle cars of, hauling people off. And you can argue about the numbers of how many died. No, you can't argue that they were cattle carring people off who were not getting the approval of the ruling class, let's say. And I've pointed out that if the people that happened to, if all they did was not show up at the train station, in other words, you can put me on the cattle car and drag me off to wherever and kill me or whatever's going to happen after that, labor camp or death or whatever it's going to be, but you're going to have to carry me from my house to the train. I'm not going to come there voluntarily. If everyone had just done that, it literally would have collapsed the plan. They didn't have the resources to physically carry even people not resisting or fighting back. It was the people complying that gave the ruling class the power to do that, which is why they focus on that. But the point of all this, getting back to the original point of when pro-freedom people imagine that those in power have sort of like infinite resources and they can enforce anything they want. No, they can't. It's literally the people who do the vast majority of enforcing against themselves by going along with it. The idea that they have the resources to have tanks and fascists going up and down every street in the U.S., no, they don't. Literally just do the math. Let's see, how many streets are there? How many towns? How many tanks would they have to have? How many? Oh, like 50% of the population would have to be soldiers. In fact, that's just at any given moment. They have to sleep at some point, so you're going to have, even if you're giving them 12-hour shifts, you're going to have twice as many. So now 2/3 of the population has to be soldiers. And you have to have administration and stuff. So basically, the only way that dystopian model works is if everybody is a soldier, nobody is a subject. That doesn't work. That's never happened anywhere in the world because it doesn't stinking work. So when pro-freedom people imagine government to have way more power than it actually does because they don't really understand how these things work, it's frustrating because then they become fearmongers for the state. Because if you scare people into thinking, well, the government can do whatever it wants, so you better comply or run off and hide. But the last thing you should do is just go, yeah, no, not going along with that. And if you send men with guns to force me to go along with whatever your stupid plan is this week, well, they might get shot. I might run away. I might hide. I might just get brutalized or murdered by them. I might shoot them. And if, like I said a million times, if 1 or 2 or 100 or 1,000 people do that, yeah, then government has the resources to go stomp on them and drive tanks through their living rooms and stuff like that. If 100 million do it, that's the end. And that remains true. So no, there isn't any such thing as, well, if this passes, it's the end of it. It's too late to fix it. We're doomed. It's totalitarianism forever. The worst tyrannies in history weren't tyrannies forever. They got less tyrannical when they fell apart. Now, North Korea is probably the worst one that's still going, and it's this pathetic waste of space. Like, I'm sure most of you have seen the satellite imagery at night of North and South Korea. North Korea might as well be like Neanderthal days. There's a little bit of light in, was it Pyongyang or something, the capital, and like almost no light in the whole country because you have tyrannical assholes ruling over victims who are producing hardly anything. And you can compare that to South Korea, which is still totally statist. The U.S. is still totally statist, but it's productive enough that they have like electricity and electric lights and stuff. But the worst example still, North Korea isn't a world power. Like, they've enslaved and indoctrinated the victims on that piece of dirt enough that they have control over them. They don't have control over anything or anybody else. And again, most of their power comes from the people there being compliant and indoctrinated and duped and delusional and by indoctrination and programming and stuff. And constant propaganda. But yeah, it's just so frustrating to watch pro-freedom people helping with the agenda of the government pretending it's all powerful. No, it isn't. And every time I see, like, this week, it's like, have you seen Project 2025? That's the end of the world. And I looked at it, I was like, that's not even worse than the normal. Like, literally everybody who's a statist advocates that their priorities and interests and preferences and beliefs be forced on everybody else by way of government. That's what it is to be a statist. That's what every Democrat does. It's what every Republican does. There are different degrees of how much of what they're trying to enforce on people and how much they're trying to rob and dominate people. But that's what every statist does. So when people go, oh, look what they're trying to do. Yeah, that's everybody who believes in government. It's what they're always trying to do. This isn't different. And the idea that, well, if this passes, that's the end. No, it isn't. And the people who think that really don't understand that the mentality of the people is the thing that matters. It isn't, like I've said a million times, I don't care how many guns the ruling class has. I care how many trigger fingers it has. And if more and more people go, I don't want to be a cop, which is happening, and more people go, I don't want to join the military, which is happening, the power falls apart more and more. And the more people there are willing and able to disobey and resist, the weaker the state gets. And the fewer people there are willing to mindlessly enforce the dictates of a ruling class, the weaker the ruling class gets. Both of those are happening. So the idea that legislation is the thing that we should give a crap about, no, it's not. It never has been. Yeah, that's them basically telegraphing their intentions of here's what we're going to try next. Notice every single stinking time the federal government, usually the political left, is like, here's the gun control we're going to try to do. A bunch of Americans run out and buy guns. And then the politicians go, oop, shit, got to back that off a little bit. Can't get away with that yet. Yeah, and you're not going to. And so even that is government admitting how little power they actually have. And even a bunch of pro-freedom people don't notice that. They don't even notice how the normal people, most of whom are still statists, still hold all the power because ruling classes get all of their power from their peasantry. It's like the guy who owns a slave plantation. He's rich because he has a bunch of obedient slaves. If the slaves just leave one day, slave master's in deep shit. And that's where mentality comes in. And the mentality of people, even though most are still statists, has been going more in the direction of voluntarism than ever in the history of the world. At least recorded history. Maybe some weird thing happened 300,000 years ago that we don't know about. But in recorded history, almost always the revolting against one ruling class was to put up a new ruling class. Now there are huge numbers, still a minority, and a tiny minority percentage-wise, but there are huge numbers of people who now understand, I don't want a ruler at all. I see the choice of Democrat and Republican, screw you both. I get to rule me. And you may have the ability to harass and rob me to a certain degree, but the moment I can disobey and resist successfully, I'm going to. That has been spreading all over the place for years now. Way more so than at any point in history. And if you look at the authoritarianism and the mindset of the people in Red China or the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, they weren't a bunch of voluntarists. They were a bunch of authoritarian collectivists, and their opposition was a bunch of authoritarian collectivists. That was the whole spectrum of ideas for the vast majority of people who lived there. That's not true anymore. Not in the U.S., anyway, and not in a lot of the Western world and even some other places. So stop giving the parasites more credit than they deserve and imagining them to be more powerful than they are. And yeah, they're a threat. Yeah, there's things worth pointing out and going, yeah, if you try this, we're not going along with that crap. Like, that's fine. But don't accidentally spread the fear-mongering. And if I have one main complaint about Alex Jones, it's that, is I think he, presumably accidentally, he's been a great fear-monger for the state by giving people the impression that government knows everything and can do everything. No, they don't. No, they can't. And to suggest otherwise literally helps the ruling class to continue their terrorist games. So, yeehaw. No, it's not too late to do anything. And no, there's not any piece of legislation that, well, if that passes, it's the end of the world. No, it isn't. The world will continue. Humanity's bumbling, stumbling, idiotic journey towards actual humanity, as in a stateless society, will continue, and it'll bumble and it'll trip, and stupid, evil things will happen along the way. But we're absolutely getting there. So this is not the time to censor yourself and hide in a corner because you think the parasites are all powerful. They're not.